I'm going to share a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. Again, my name is Mara Walsh. I'm coming to you live from the United States and specifically between Philadelphia and New York. I started leading physical tours with EF Tours as a Girl Scout leader, taking girls and their families to international destinations every summer. I have since expanded my physical travel program. Now I also lead adult-only tours with EF Go-Ahead Tours, as well as several other organizations. I also offer family-friendly tours, and as a certified travel agent, I can also book you on your dream trip as part of a group or on your own. Just reach out to me if you're starting to think about physical travel again, and let me know where you'd like to go. In terms of virtual tours, there's a couple reasons why I started this series last year. I really wanted to support the tour director community during this time of travel restrictions where they have not been able to work. And I really wanted to keep the excitement of travel alive for my travel group. And since we have extended that opportunity to those of you who've learned about us through friends or family on social media or by other means. We've done more, I think we've done about 50 tours at this point in the last year since COVID has struck. If you'd like to access any of the recordings, they're still available on my website, girltraveltours.com. There's a virtual tours drop-down menu where you can access any of the tours that we have done since last year. You can also access them through my YouTube channel or my Facebook page. And we have several more tours planned for the coming year. Many are listed on my website, and I'm going to share a screen so that you can see which ones are ready for signups. We have Victorian London, Yellowstone National Park, Communism in the Eastern Bloc, Salzburg, the Sound of Music Tour, Milan, Mystery in Transylvania, which is at Halloween time, Northern Spain, and Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. Check back often as we add new destinations all the time. And as long as you're interested in viewing these virtual tour presentations, we will continue to produce them for you. I know many of you have found our virtual events through Facebook, and I just wanted to give another warning for those of you out there. You should not be buying tickets or paying upfront to access these events. They are free to attend. You can, at the end of the tour, choose to give a tip to the tour director, but you should not be paying to attend. So if you did pay for this tour, please know that you should contact Facebook or your credit card for reimbursement or to alert them that you've been charged improperly. So I just want to let you know that you can always safely access my tours and my signups in the Zoom registrations from my website, girltraveltours.com. Okay, so before we get going, I want to share with you a few ways that you could interact with us. Feel free to ask questions about the tour director, or my travel program in the Q&A. There's a link at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. You can also use the chat feature to communicate with me directly. These chats will not be addressed in the Q&A portion of the event, but I will do my best to try to answer any of the questions that are posed to me. And as you well know, if you've been on these tours with us before, and if not, I'm going to tell you that we like to add a little interactive polling for our viewers, and this kind of gives us an understanding of what your knowledge is of the region we're going to visit. So what's your connection to Brittany and Mont St Michel? I've been and I love it. I have a trip booked. I plan to go in the future. I have no set plans, but I'm interested in the location. I am solely interested in experiencing it virtually. Now, this is one region I have not visited myself yet, so I would say I plan to go in the future. I honestly thought I visited this region because I think a lot of people get confused sometimes with Saint Michel and some of the places that you see when you're in Paris, that it wasn't until I had been back in Paris for several times that I realized that it was a completely different region. So hopefully I will learn a little bit more about this region tonight with all of you. So it looks like I'm going to end the poll. And it looks like we have about 44% that are in the same boat as which is I have no set plans, but I'm interested in the location. We have about 22% of people who've been and loved it, which is pretty good. So I'm going to share these results with the audience so that you can see. And if you see that window does not go down in front of the presentation, you could just click on the top left button, which is the little red button, which will allow you to close out on that. Okay, so today's tour and all of our tours are scheduled for 90 minutes plus a Q&A. So I hope you're ready with a snack or a drink in hand. Sit back, get ready. We're going to have a great tour presentation. And as we all know, a tour would not be complete without a fantastic tour director. For those unfamiliar with group travel, a tour director is like a personal travel concierge who stays with your group from start to finish and shares a world of knowledge, manages all your travel plans, and makes sure your experience is full of education, it's stressless, and it's easy to navigate. These are by far the most important people in your group. And I will share with you via chat and during the Q&A ways that you can tip the tour director if you feel that this presentation was valuable to you. All of the tips go directly to the tour director once collected, minus the Zoom operating expenses. I'm hoping that this virtual tour will not only keep our desire to travel alive, but it will also provide you with an opportunity to see a wonderful tour director and see what he has to offer tonight. Today, we are lucky to have back one of our favorite tour guides. I thought coming to us from France, but he's not. He's actually on holiday, so he'll talk a little bit about where he's coming to you from. This region in France has captured the heart of Louis, and I believe he recently visited there on holiday. And I'm sure that we will see just why he loves this region so much on his presentation tonight. So I'd like to welcome back Louis to join us. Louis, if you're ready, you can join us and you can share your screen and we can get going.
Hi, everybody. I will just share my screen and then I'll be with you. Here we go. View full screen, and there we go. We should be good. Hopefully, Mara, yeah, you can see me. Okay, perfect. Well, good evening, everybody. Good end of the afternoon for a lot of you who I think are in North America from the comments that I saw at the beginning. My name is Louis Irvin. I've been a tour guide for how long? 12 years, I guess now. It was 10 years at the point that the pandemic started, or 11 years, but now I guess it's 12. Even if we weren't able to work in person at all over the last year and a half. And so largely it's thanks to Mara that it has been possible for me to work in this period of time since COVID. So I wanted to say thank you, firstly, to start with that. I've done a few of these different tours. Hold on 2 seconds, I'm just gonna put this on silent, I'm sorry. I've done a few of these different tours. I must have done about 5 or 6 of them since the beginning of Mara's online travel program. And the last 2 in particular, so the last one I did was about Provence in the south of France, which is actually where I live. And so this time I'm doing one on a region in France, which is the furthest possible away from the one where I live, and probably one of the most different in terms of culture. So I'm quite happy to be doing it, the region that I like a lot. I'm from Scotland originally. I grew up in Edinburgh and I lived in Glasgow for 11 years before moving to the south of France in 2018. And I was supposed to be calling you from the south of France tonight, but in fact, I'm calling you from my parents' house in Scotland, where I'm visiting them for a holiday. So it's a bit confusing. I live in France, I'm from Scotland, I'm phoning you from Scotland to talk about France. And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is Brittany, or Bretagne in French, or Breige in Breton, and Mont St Michel, which is actually not in Brittany. So I'm going to talk to you about lots of things to do with Breton culture and with the region of Brittany, and I'm going to talk to you about Mont Saint Michel because it's one of the most sort of important touristic destinations in France. I guess I wanted to maybe start by just showing you some kind of images that we characteristically maybe associate with Brittany. But before that, I wanted just to situate it a little bit in the map of France for you. So if you look at this map of the whole of France, you can see where we are. You have bordering with the UK across the channel at the top, with Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and Spain at the bottom. And where I live is the green region down on the bottom right-hand corner. That's Provence, Alpes, Côte d'Azur. And where we're going to be talking about today is Brittany, which is the very top left one. So you can see it's really the northwestern extremity of France, okay? It's really the furthest you can go west in all of France. In France, which is this sort of very important central country in modern Europe, you have 18 regions, okay? And within those regions, you have 101 departments. So any of you that have been counting very fast, looking at this map, you'll realize that there's actually less than 18 here. And that's because 5 of these regions, bizarrely, are not actually in the mainland, okay? You have Martinique, Guadeloupe, Corsica, Réunion, and Mayotte. So you have 2 in the Caribbean, 1 off the coast of France, and 2 off the coast of East Africa. And of the 15 regions that are within France, Brittany is one of them. And like I said, within those regions, you have departments. So here's a bit of a clearer map where you can see the regions more clearly. And you can see, like I said before, me, I live in Provence, Alpes, Côte d'Azur, which is the bottom right. And today I'm talking to you about Brittany. So one of the things that's quite interesting about France, and I feel gets a bit lost on the kind of international, I guess, marketing of France. One of the amazing things is the diversity of landscapes and cultures in this country. Okay, so I think often, certainly from an international perspective, we have this idea of Paris that's very clear, that's very romanticized. We think about like the Eiffel Tower, maybe Moulin Rouge. You have this image of how buildings look. And then most people have a kind of idea of something to do with the south of France, maybe with Nice, Saint-Tropez, sort of beautiful beaches, pleasure boats, casinos, da da da. And then for a lot of people, the rest of it is kind of a bit of a jumble, right? Maybe at the limit, people have some ideas about Normandy and they think about World War II, the D-Day landings, etc. But in general, I feel like a lot of the other regions of France get quite overlooked from a sort of touristic perspective. Whereas within France, these regions don't get overlooked at all. So for example, Brittany, where we're going to be today, is one of the most popular tourist destinations for French people themselves. Okay, so a lot of French people travel to Brittany on vacation every year. Here's a bit of a map, sort of zooming in a little bit, so where you can see the departments that are in each of these regions. And then here, finally, we find ourselves looking at a map of Brittany. So you can see there's these 4 departments, right? There's Finistère, Le Côte d'Amour, Morbihan, and Ille-et-Vilaine. And you can see there's a few sort of cities dotted around. The most sort of significant 2 cities are Rennes, which is the capital on the right-hand side, and Brest, which is a kind of seaside city on the left-hand side of this image. Today, actually, we're not going to look at either of those cities. So what I've decided to give you today is firstly a bit of a sort of general looking at some of the landscapes and some of the things we associate with Brittany, talking a little bit about its culture and how specific it is in relationship to France in general. And then I want to show you the places that for me are the most beautiful and the most interesting in Brittany. So this is absolutely by no means going to be an exhaustive presentation where I show you absolutely everything that there is to see in Brittany, but much more like me spending a bit of time talking to you about the places that I think are really worth visiting. And so where we're going to visit is St Malo, which you can see on the north coast there. And then 2 little towns which are right next to it, which aren't on this map, Dinard and Dinan. And then we're going to look at Mont St Michel, which is actually just across the border in Normandy. And then we're going to go down to the bottom of the map to Quiberon and the Belle-Île, okay, the beautiful island. That's largely what we're going to be looking at. And then we're going to finish off today by looking at some of the delicious, delicious things there are to eat in Brittany. So I guess I wanted to start in this little introductory section just with taking a couple of images and looking at the kinds of landscapes and the kinds of things we associate with Brittany. So this first image is an image of St Malo, which for me is one of the most beautiful towns that I think probably ever visited in France, which has such an interesting history and culture and is a place very, very worth visiting. It's often quite overlooked. And so I want to show you this photo because it's quite striking, but also to show you the sea in the first image. So for me, when I think about Brittany, I think about the sea. And I think about all kinds of culture that's linked with the sea and with sailing and with seafood. It's a culture that's very much linked with its coastlines. So you can see here, this is a beach just off St Malo. So this is actually right in the city centre of St Malo. So beach culture and the sea are two things we associate with Brittany. Also kind of wild landscapes and kind of outdoor, walking, hill walking, cycling, mountain biking, quite active sort of outdoor lifestyle. And you can see for any of you that have been to Scotland, you can see this could very easily be Scotland. This could very easily be the Western Isles. And in fact, you're going to see as we go through this presentation that there are a lot of things in common between Brittany and Great Britain just across the channel. Again, this photo, you see even the style of architecture, this could very plausibly be somewhere in the west of Scotland. You also, more in the interior of Brittany, this is one of the towns we're going to visit a little bit later in the tour. In the interior of Brittany, you also have a lot of sort of very well preserved medieval towns. So this is Dinard, which we will look at a bit later. And that means medieval towns brings with it this kind of architecture. Which, for example, in the south of France where I live, you would just never see this kind of architecture anywhere. Or in really big cities like Paris, you wouldn't see this kind of architecture. It's all gone by now, burned down or destroyed or replaced. In Britain, there's a lot of it. Cider and people drinking. This is a big, it's maybe another thing I have in common with Scotland somehow. But this is a big stereotype about Breton culture. Is that people drink a lot, okay? And because the weather is known for being quite bad in Brittany, maybe I'll come back to that in a second, and that's mixed with a culture where people really like to drink ale and cider and wine. That means that the Breton people have a bit of a reputation of being a bit kind of, I don't know how to describe it. I think I saw one person on the chat saying they were from Scotland, but so maybe you'll understand when I say that Breton people have a reputation for being a bit dour, like being a bit like, it's kind of unfriendly, but it's not really unfriendly. It's a bit kind of cynical, or, like it's very rainy. You've got to drink a lot to survive there. It's a certain kind of hardness that can also be very, very warm and very, very welcoming. So we think about drinking, we think about Brittany, in particular cider. It's very, very famous for cider. I think about galettes. I'm going to come back and talk with much love and admiration for this Breton food when I come back to talking about food at the end of the presentation. Sailing is another huge association with Brittany and the culture of Brittany. And it has some of the biggest sort of maritime festivals in Europe are dotted around Brittany. And in general, especially places like St Malo, there's a very strong link between most people and the sea from a young age. Also bad weather. So yeah, I said this already, but I had a couple of little images. The Breton newspaper, and the headline, Pourquoi l'été est pourri? Why summer is rotten? And it's someone looking off into the sort of miserable sea. And then here, this person standing on the rock, ça c'est la Bretagne. That's Brittany. So it's a bit of a reputation for having a bit of a kind of self-deprecating humor about the weather. And, there's a lot of kind of stereotypes about the north and the south in France, where, people say that the south they seem more friendly in the south, but actually they're not really very friendly. And in the north, they seem quite unfriendly, but actually they're very warm. It just takes a bit of time. This flag, which is quite a strange flag, this is the flag of Brittany. So I wanted, before I say a couple of little bits about history, just to say that there's a very strong contemporary identity in Brittany, which dates back to, the beginning of its time as a region. And people from Brittany, they're called Breton. And so that's B-R-E-T-O-N. So you're Breton if you're from Brittany. And they have a very strong identification with their culture and with their identity. And so actually, I found quite a good study that was done in 2012 that had some sort of statistics about this, that was saying that in Brittany, only 22% of people consider themselves only French. And a massive 38% of people considered themselves as French as they are Breton. So their identity as a French person and as a Breton were really equal. And that 14% of people felt more Breton than French. So you can realize that's quite high. That's very, very high. Maybe again, in its own weird way, another kind of comparison with Scotland in terms of how people think about Britain. Back in the day, of course, Brittany was its kind of own territory, right? And so, as with much of France, France was, like everywhere else in Europe, a big collection of little territories before the Middle Ages. And in the 15th century, when France got all pulled together, Brittany got sucked into it. But somehow, for some reason, the people in Brittany have really kept their culture quite specific to themselves and have stayed in touch with a lot of their cultural practices. And so, yeah, a lot of people feel, I wouldn't say they feel as strong as not French, but a lot of people feel like their Breton identity is very, very important. And just another little note on this flag. The flag is actually quite a modern invention. It was designed in 1923, and it's called Gwenhadou, which means white and black in Breton. And it features 11 ermine spots and 9 stripes. And the black ones represent Breton-speaking dioceses, like church areas where people speak Breton. And the white represent the dioceses where people speak Gallo, which is another dialect. And why ermine? Basically, it's because back in really the Middle Ages, there's a lot of ermine in Brittany. Do you know what I mean? They're kind of like mink, I guess, or ferrets. And back in the Middle Ages, there were a lot of them in Brittany. And so the dukes of Brittany, they used to wear their clothes entirely. They had these big robes made out of ermine, kind of like a mink coat. And so the symbol tradition of the region was this kind of aristocratic crest with this ermine on it. And in the 20s, the Breton people, they felt it was a bit old-fashioned and a bit aristocratic. And so they replaced it with this. And this flag was, believe it or not, based on the US flag. So you'll notice that while I was talking there, I said the Breton language. Ah, yeah, look, here's a bit of an image as well. You can see the further you go over to the left of Brittany, people get more and more identifying as Breton, okay? So in that whole little spiel that I just did there about the flag, I mentioned Breton speaking. So for any of you that don't know this, Breton is in fact a language which is spoken in Brittany. And so I've got this image for you, which I quite like, which is a college demonstration. College is like, it's the equivalent of in the US, middle school. So it's like, I guess, 12 till 15 or 16. And what these kids are doing here is they're doing a demonstration. And what their banner says is, oui à une filière bilingue au Collège Charles de Gaulle. So it says yes to one pathway bilingual in our college. So these are young Breton kids who are protesting to have the right to do their studies in French and in Breton, okay? So Breton is a language which still exists today. There's about 220,000 people who speak this language, so it's not a huge language by any way, especially since the total population in Britain is about 6 million, so it's very, very small. It's about 4% of the population who can really speak it, and that's much more in the west of Brittany. Why that is, I'm going to explain in a little minute. These days, it's a lot, you know, it's coming back in lots of ways. There's a bit of a Breton resurgence, and a lot of kind of government money and regional money goes into trying to promote the Breton language and keeping people to speak it. So in lots of parts in Brittany, you'll see bilingual road signs. So you'll see road signs that are in French and they're in Breton. You would very rarely see one that was just in Breton, and you would struggle to find places in Brittany where people only spoke Breton. So it's more like a language which is struggling to stay alive rather than a language which really dominates the area. For those of you that came on my last tour, the one of Provence, you'll remember that I talked a bit about Provençal as the language which predates France in the area. And that under Napoleon, there was this big attempt to crush these local languages and dialects. But why, I guess the question is, why do the Breton people, why do people in Bretagne have such a specific language, and where does that come from? I guess the big answer, and this is where the whole history of Brittany gets interesting for me, although this time I will warn you, I'm not going to get too stuck in history like I did on my earlier tours. I want to try and show you as many things as possible. But this connection to this language comes from the fact that Brittany is in fact a Celtic province, right? So if you look at this map, what you understand as Celtic, usually people understand as Celtic Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, right? Actually, in that, people are missing some other important places, the Isle of Man, Cornwall, which is a very, very western tip of England, and also Brittany, which you can see down here on the map. And so there's this text here where they say, I can read it to you, Vous êtes de la grande race des Celtes. So you're from Britain people, you're from the grand race of Celts. And it's saying, mais combien d'entre vous connaissant son histoire et cependant elle est riche d'événements qui vous donneront joie ou tristesse et qui se sont déroulés sur cette terre bretonne où vous êtes né. Et lorsque vous aurez appris l'histoire de vos ancêtres qui forment l'un des peuples le plus brave et le plus glorieux de l'Europe, vous serez fiers d'être breton. So it says, how many between you even know your history, despite the fact that your history is so rich and full of events which will give you joy and sadness, and which took place in this Britain earth where you were born. When you've learned the history of your ancestors, who were one of the most brave and most glorious people of Europe, you'll be proud to be Breton. So for any of you that have traveled in Ireland or Scotland or have Irish or Scottish roots, you'll know that this thing about sort of Celtic identity is very, very strong. So if we look at this map of Celtic Europe in 400 BC, you can see that Celts had a very sort of major control over sort of Central Europe, right? And in the time before the Romans, they filled up what were the British Isles, right? So Ireland and Scotland and England, etc. And certainly everywhere where there is France today, that there were Celtic people. When the Romans came, maybe I'll start here. When the Romans came, well, no, maybe I'll go back a little bit actually, hold on. So the fact that they are Celtic, right? There were these Celtic indigenous people that were in Brittany, that were in a lot of France. That legacy rests on today also in not just forms of the language. And again, if you look at this map, you think in Scotland, they have Gaelic, in Ireland, they have Gaelic, in Wales, they have Welsh, and in Bretagne, you have Breton. It stayed on in the language, but it also stayed on in certain aspects of sort of the musical culture. And also that there's a lot of sort of Celtic memorials and remnants and remains that stay in Brittany today. So in just a couple of minutes, I'll show you some photos of some of the most famous sort of standing stones in all of France, which are left by the Celts in Brittany. So anyway, what I wanted to say is that I guess in the Romans, I'm having to jump back a bit forward here. You can see this this map here. This is kind of how the Romans looked at what was France, okay? And they wanted to conquer what the Romans called Armorica, which is roughly where we'd situate Brittany today. So if you look up there, you can see Aramorio, but Armorica is what the Romans called Brittany. And under Caesar in 56 BC, they came in and it all became part of the Roman Empire. In fact, Armorica was just came from the Celtic word for by the sea, okay? So this is where it got its original name. They pushed very, very generally far to the west in Europe. So if you look at this map, I find this helps me understand things a lot, is that before the Romans arrived, there were Celts in all of these places that you can see that are green on this map, in Scotland, in Wales, in England, in Ireland, in the rest of France. And as they pushed west and west and west and west, they eventually got up to Scotland where they couldn't get much further. And so that Scotland stayed a Celtic country. Wales, they struggled to really get into, so Wales stayed a Celtic country. Ireland, they never really set foot on. And you can imagine the very western corner of England in Cornwall held out a little bit. And a bit the same is true in Brittany. And so today, where you have people still speaking these Celtic languages, it's kind of amazing to think about that in some ways, still this many thousands of years later, being something that was caused by kind of Roman conquest. Because really, if you look at this map and you draw a line straight down, you can see this is just the very western tips of Europe. And that's where the Celtic languages, these Celtic languages survived. So I find that quite amazing to think about. Anyway, another little fact for you here about where Brittany gets its name, in case you didn't know this, is that the Romans ruled for a very long time. They had a lot of success in this part of Western Europe. But after Rome fell, in the 5th and 6th centuries, Anglo-Saxons started attacking what is now Britain a lot. And in the 5th and 6th century, there was a big exodus of people from Britain who crossed the Channel to look for safer places to live in France. And many of these people from Britain who arrived in Brittany, in the sort of northwestern tip of France, and they were the ones who gave Brittany its name. Okay, so Brittany comes from Britain. So it's kind of like another Britain across the English Channel. And here, just to finish this little bit on Celt, I have this little map of the different Celtic nations. And you can see there on the left is the Breton flag with the ermine stars. This means that lots and lots of things have held on today in Breton culture. So you look at this photo, you would definitely think that this was in Scotland, wouldn't you? But no, this is in fact people playing traditional music in Brittany today. And like I said, also it stays on really in this rich tradition of sort of Celtic ruins. Okay, so here you have the stones at Carnac, which you might have heard of, C-A-R-N-A-C. And this is a huge megalithic site of dolmens dating to between 4,000 and 3,000 BC. Okay, and it's one of the largest collections of stones like this in the world. You can see there's, I mean, really a lot of them. So this is something very worth visiting if ever you're in Britain. This is down near Quiberon, which we're going to look at a bit later in the south. So yeah, that's a little bit about sort of some of the Celtic origins of Brittany's culture. And I wanted to just be able to give you a rough idea to think about this idea that you have France, which is like this. I'm struggling to speak English. I keep wanting to use French words. France, which is like this big collection of different provinces that are quite different. And in the 1500s, they sucked them all together to make a country. But actually at its base, if that had never really happened, it's quite conceivable to imagine Brittany as a little kind of country, a Celtic country on the northwestern seaboard of France. I'm not going to talk too much more about history. That's the most bit of interesting kind of bits of history for me, or some of Brittany's older history. I just wanted to say, I guess, that it was from the early Middle Ages that Brittany had a more of a distinct sense as a region, you know, that those boundaries were drawn around what we now call Brittany, and it became a duchy. It was first united in the 9th century under this person who was called Nomino, and who led a revolt against the ruling dynasty. And so for about 1,000 years, the Breton people have had an idea that they are Breton and that Bretagne ends somewhere. And it wasn't until 1532 that in fact they got sucked right into France. Brittany came to riches and made a lot of money and put itself a lot more on the scene in the 16th and 17th century. And this was largely to do with pirate and privateer culture. So when we talk about St Malo, we're going to come back and talk about this. But the 16th and the 17th century were real swashbuckling times for the people of Brittany. And as I'm sure you know, in the 17th century, certainly, and the beginning of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, so much of the sort of geopolitics and global struggle for trade and control in the world happened on the seas. And so Brittany, being a place where people really knew how to sail, really, really helped them to play a crucial role in a lot of that. There's a lot of pirate culture in Brittany, and we're going to come back to that when we talk about St Malo. I just wanted to do two little side notes to say that the two biggest things that I'm not going to talk about today, just because I feel like lots of people who visit Brittany, they go straight to these things, and I don't think they're necessarily the most interesting, are the capital, which is Rennes, which is a really perfectly nice city. It's actually got one of the highest ratings for quality of life in France. It's got about 800,000 people in it, so it's big but not too big. It's kind of lively, nice town. And then Brest, which is on the, never eat shredded wheat, on the western coast, which I'm also not going to talk about. Brest, I think, however, is worth a bit of a visit. I just didn't have time to talk about it today with all of the other places I'm going to talk about. It's a port city of about 150,000 people, and it's really the most sort of western. It was a very important military harbour. These days it's a kind of university town, but it still has this rich sailing culture. And it's there where they have the French Naval Academy. And also every 4 years, they have the International Festival of the Sea, Boats and Sailors, which is called Les Tonnerres de Brest, which is like a massive maritime festival where loads and loads and loads of boats sail into the city. So if you're interested in boats, I think Brest is definitely somewhere worth a visit. You can see it just over there on the very west coast. That brings us neatly to St Malo. So just to go back to this map, you can see up there, it's on the north coast, off towards the right in the English Channel. St Malo is a totally charming, beautiful place to visit. I really, the first time I visited, I was totally awestruck. I mean, look at it already. The architecture it's so bizarre. It's a really small town, actually, of about 50,000 people, built on a rock, standing in a very naturally defensive position at the mouth of the river Rance. Okay, and it's been a town since Roman times. Malo, it's quite a strange. Look at this beautiful photo of it in snowy winter. Malo is a bit of a strange name. It got its name from a traveling monk who came from Llanffarfan Abbey in Wales, whose name was Maclovius. Okay, and he was a disciple and a fellow traveler of St Brendan, who you might have heard of, who traveled and did a lot of missionaryizing. Missioning? I don't know how to make that into a verb, in Ireland. And so Maclovius was one of the many Celtic people who came over to Brittany when it was called Armorica, during the troubled times at the end of the Roman era. And so that's where St Malo gets its name. I guess it developed a lot of its importance as a kind of seaport in the 16th century. Like I said, it's a very strategic part of the French coast. It's kind of the last main channel port before you have to go around Brittany, around the edge of the coast, which all of the merchant ships from the North Sea and English Channel had to do for a long time. So it was a really good place to stop, to take on or drop off supplies, to pick up crew members, etc., etc. And in the history, oh, look at it, isn't it nice? Also, can you imagine that you're right in the city and you have these beaches? It's really, really lovely. So over time in the 16th and the 17th century, St Malo became famous for two very important things, which it remains famous for today. And both of those things were linked with the sea. And those things were piratry, so pirates, and exploration of the New World. Okay, so people sailing across the Atlantic to explore, colonize the Americas. Look, here's a very nice sort of Middle Ages engraving of St Malo. So the weather is very, very famously rough in St Malo. Not just the weather, but specifically the tides are very difficult, and there's a lot of unforeseen currents. And so I wonder, yeah, this photo here. No, you can't see it. I have a photo later where you can see where the people sail. So basically there was this idea right from hundreds of years ago that if you could sail around St Malo, you could sail anywhere in the world. Okay, so it was the most sort of fearsome and reputed sailors' reputations, certainly in the north of France, but largely in the country as well. So even today, when you go there, there's this very strong culture of getting young kids to sail from a very, very young age. So this in the 16th and 17th century produced a lot of pirates or privateers or corsairs, as they're called here. So I'm going to say privateer, I think, today, because corsair, it's funny to move between French and English. But the difference between a privateer and a pirate is that a privateer is basically a pirate with papers. So like a pirate that has the legal right to do what they're doing. And basically the idea is a sort of private person or a boat that is raiding other boats and taking their bounty. And so part of the deal, one of the reasons why there were so many pirates is because the French were really often beefing with the Spanish ships and with the British ships. And so at various different points, various different kings in France, they gave royal charters to the privateers of St Malo. So they gave them official papers that they said, you have the right to do whatever you want to British or Spanish ships. You just have to give us a kickback of the loot that you get from those boats. So you can imagine if you were really, really good at sailing, that would be a really, really good career path in the period. And so they kind of wreaked havoc on Spanish and English ships. In the same way that the English were doing similar things, you know, when you think about people like Sir Francis Drake, the famous sort of English explorer, you know, Queen Elizabeth was sending him forth to sort of pillage French ships. So they were kind of all doing it to themselves. Lots of the pirates in St Malo, the privateers, they became very, very, very wealthy from this. So I'm going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes. And lots of Breton families, you know, they trace their families who are wealthy today, they trace their money back to pirate money. So there's this real sort of, I guess, pirate culture that comes from this never-ending maritime conflict with the bigger neighbors of Spain and England. So I wanted to tell you just about a couple of famous people from St Malo. I'm really sorry about how pixelated this photo is. It's the best I can do. But this is René Duguay-Trouin, who was born in St Malo in the 1670s, was a captain of his own, basically pirate ship at 18, took control of a massive 40-gunner pirate ship at the age of 21, and was famous for having captured more than 300 merchant ships and 16 warships, okay? And in fact, Louis XV was so happy with his pirating skills that he made him a lieutenant general of one of his naval armies. So you'll see a statue of him in St Malo near the Quai Saint-Louis. And so there was often this big link. It's funny when we think about pirates, often we think about like totally wild and lawless behavior. But there was this big link between the pirates of St Malo and the kings of France. They were kind of working together with them. You know, it was a successful strategy to slow down the success of rival nations in the English Channel. They terrified the merchant ships. There's a couple of other famous ones. So this is another very famous one. This is Robert Surcouf, which maybe you've heard of. It's a very famous name in French history. He's from St Malo, and he was famous. One of his famous things that he did in his long and illustrious privateer career was that supposedly he single-handedly killed 11 men in duels, which is quite shocking. He is one of many people that left behind very sort of luxurious houses in the area in and around of St Malo. So these pirates, they went out to the sea and they lived these totally wild and very, very violent lives. And then they came back to St Malo and they were really rich and they were like, well, actually, we want to live like gentlemen while we're in St Malo. You know, we can live really violently at sea, but we want to live kind of like aristocrats when we come back here. And so they built these very famous aristocratic houses, okay? And we call these malouineries. So like the malouinerie, that translates as like the houses of the people from St Malo. And there's quite a few of them that still stay around the coast. There's about 60 of them in the area around St Malo. And some of them you can actually visit. This one you can visit. This is called La Ville-Bague. And this was the house of an ex-privateer, so of a St Malo pirate. And you can see they're decorated in these very sort of ornate aristocratic styles. So it's quite a strange culture, this sort of aristocratic pirate culture, which you have in St Malo. But you didn't just have pirates and people that were robbing people on the seas. You also had people that were robbing people in the process of colonization. But you had what people in lots of moments in history were calling explorers, which maybe today we can call a bit more colonizers, who were involved in colonizing countries outside of Europe. And probably St Malo's most famous son is this guy, Jacques Cartier. So even the name today, Cartier, is very, very famous. He was born in St Malo in 1491, and it was from St Malo that he left in 1534 on his first voyage of discovery of the New World. Okay, and any of you that are joining us from Canada tonight, you'll know his name, and you'll know that he established New France on the Gaspé Peninsula on the North American continent, which is now part of Quebec. And so there's a lot of sort of images of him in, this is written, Les Explorateurs Célèbres, the famous explorers. And this is him supposedly meeting with First Nations chiefs. He came back to St Malo after that, and he came on a second voyage, and he sailed up the St. Lawrence River until eventually he stopped, and he named the place he stopped Mont Royal. And the way it was spelled in the age was Montréal, and that's where we get the name Montreal today. He's buried in St Malo, Jacques Cartier. And today in the old town, there's this museum, La Maison du Québec. So it's a kind of museum in St Malo that's dedicated to the history of Quebec and the links between St Malo and Quebec. So it's a museum worth visiting. Here's an image of the ramparts of St Malo. I'm going to come back and maybe talk about the ramparts in a little while. They were built up in the 17th century, really to protect St Malo from attack and from sea. And it was those same walls that were still surrounding St Malo when we got into the 20th century, into the bombardment of St Malo, which happened in World War II, okay? So they were not actually able to completely defend the city of St Malo. That had a huge bombardment, both by the Germans and by the Allies, and a large part of the old city was reduced to rubble. In fact, rebuilding St Malo was one of the big sort of post-war reconstruction project that the French government took part in. They wanted to rebuild it exactly the way it was, to not make any inappropriate modernizing developments, anything like that. Here you have some photos. And the bombardment of St Malo is actually in this, which maybe some of you have read, which I read the first time I think I went to visit St Malo, All the Light We Cannot See, which is this huge bestseller novel, which takes place during the bombardment of St Malo, which is worth a read. I thought it was good. And if this visit tonight has piqued your interest, this book is some suggested further reading. Just before moving on from St Malo, I just wanted to talk about a couple of the things that are worth doing. One of them is definitely the beaches. So the beaches are one of the #1 tourist attractions in St Malo. They're very, very accessible. There's a lot of them. There's also these ramparts which go all around the town, which are about a distance of 2 kilometers. Which I guess has got to make up sort of one of the most interesting in a town walks in all of France, right? Because for 2 kilometers you can walk all the way around this kind of quite amazing architecture of a city that looks right out onto the sea. You have also this, which is the L'Étoile du Roi. It's one of the, hold on 2 seconds, lost my place. Ah, yes, it's the second largest tall ship in France. Sorry, I couldn't remember if it's the largest tall ship of France or the second largest. It's the second largest tall ship of France, and it still moves. It's a visitable museum. It still moves. So it's not actually always there, but if it is in town in St Malo, it's definitely something that's worth visiting. It was built for this big British TV series called The Grand Turk, and it was also used in the British TV series Hornblower. If any of you have seen that, it's a big kind of naval battle TV series. But anyway, it's docked for about half of the year in St Malo, and it's definitely something worth visiting. There's also a really nice kind of cafe and restaurant culture. I have to say it's quite chic, St Malo, so it's a bit more upmarket for eating, but definitely worth it for a nice day out in a longer trip to Brittany. And so here's a famous terrace and hotel de Chateaubriand. And I have a picture of it from the terrace, and then another picture of it here where you can see really with St Malo, you're in the town with these big buildings around you, but you're just next to the sea, which I think is a really, exciting city to live. Often when you live in a city by the sea, it's not quite like this, with a kind of downtown area so close to the beaches. You also have just outside St Malo, you have a couple of different forts, the fort of Grand Bay and then Fort National. And these forts are interesting because they're tidal. So when the tide is in, you can't get out and you have to wait for the tide to go out to walk across to them. And I want to just at this point to just pause and tell you a little story, which is kind of in some ways almost a bit relevant to COVID, which is basically that, I can't remember if we talked about this. Yeah, we must have talked about this in my Provence tour when we talked about Marseille. That this would definitely happen back up here, that in the Middle Ages and beyond the Middle Ages, people were very, very worried about plague and disease coming off boats that were coming from the New World or the Middle East or even just elsewhere in Europe. And so when a big boat arrived after a long voyage, you'd have to stop and they'd have to dock on a nearby island while they'd wait for a period of quarantine to see if any disease popped up in any of the crew. And so these islands that you can see dotted around the outskirts of St Malo, they served as quarantine islands. And just a little fact for anyone that wasn't on my last tour, anyone that forgot it, is that 40 in French is 40. And so they would have to stop for 40 days. So it was for a quarantaine, so 40 days worth. And that's where we get the word quarantine from today. Okay, so we've just been in St Malo, up on the north coast. On the Emerald Coast, you can see it's marked there, the Côte d'Emeraude. It's called the Emerald Coast, this little bit of Brittany, because the waters they can be very, very green and kind of emerald colored. And so before we move on to Mont St Michel, I wanted to show you 2 other little spots that are worth visiting that are not so far from St Malo that can make up quite a nice kind of itinerary if you've got a few days in the region. So there's 2 of them that are a bit confusing because they have similar names, Dinard and Dinan. You can see them here, Dinard and Dinan. And Dinard is the one that's on the coast. That's a bit of like a kind of a pleasure town for sort of aristocratic English tourists in the past. And then Dinan is the very well preserved medieval one. So maybe if we start with Dinard. Here you can see this. To be honest, when I look at this picture, this makes me think of the south of France. Doesn't make me think about the north of France. Dinard is a kind of small town with about 15,000 people in it. Very famous for it has a very good film festival. It has a lot of kind of quite fancy villas, fancy hotels, casinos, and a lot of the kind of wealthy corsair and privateer merchants from St Malo. They were the people that built Dinard in its beginnings. All right. So if they got a bit too wealthy for St Malo or it was a bit too indiscreet, they could go along the coast a little bit and have kind of more space and better, I guess, real estate, more possible space. It became really, really popular with English tourists at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so they started building in the end of the 1800s, a lot of these kind of very big luxurious villas. So you see these kind of, the style of architecture is quite unusual. About 400 villas along the coast in Dinard. And it's interesting because the end of the 19th century, the English sort of upper classes, they flocked here in huge, huge numbers. It was the place they wanted to be in summer. until the 1930s, when it got replaced with the Côte d'Azur in the south, with Nice and everywhere. So where we went to on the last tour that I did. Up until the 1930s, if you had a bit of money and you wanted to jet set a little bit, you wanted to be here rather than in the south of France. People called it the Cannes of the North. Okay? And even today, you can see these kind of quite English-looking houses that are up on the shore. There's also, it was kind of the beginning of bathing culture, this whole new way of bathing. And so there's still a lot of that today, sort of quite expensive beaches that are, you know, very comfortable in order to swim in the sea. This is the pool. Now, I wanted to show you these three locations together, St Malo, Dinard, and then Dinan, because in fact, they're all joinable together on boats, which I think is a really great way to travel and a way that we don't travel enough on when we're on vacation. But basically from St Malo to Dinard, so the journey we've already done, you can actually take a very short boat that just crosses over the harbor there that costs less than $10 and takes you to Dinard. But from Dinard to Dinan, the next time that we're going to, you can take a slightly longer boat, which takes about 2 hours and 45 minutes or 2.5 hours. It costs about $40, and it will take you all the way down the Rance to Dinan. And so this is a really nice little holiday itinerary. If you spend a couple of days in St Malo, get the boat over to Dinard, spend the day in Dinard, and then get the boat down the Rance to Dinan to finish this part of the country. This is what the boat looks like. It's very cute. And then you arrive in Dinan, and this is Dinan. Dinan for me is more of an interesting place to visit than Dinard. Dinard is a little bit like a kind of playground for the rich by the sea, and Dinan is a bit more rich in its kind of its history. It's definitely one of the sort of most attractive and the best preserved little medieval towns in Brittany. It's very small. Again, it's got about 15,000 people. So these are both quite small towns. And again, it's a little walled town. It has about 2 miles of ramparts around the edge, so you can do another rampart walk. And a lot of, well, very attractive little ports, and a lot of these beautiful, completely sort of medieval, authentic Middle Ages wood-clad houses, okay? Which I personally find really incredible that they're still existing after so many years. So you can see really sort of beautiful. I mean, I guess if you look at this, I wouldn't necessarily think this was in France. Looking at this photo, I would think this is going to be either in Germany or maybe in England. So again, it's quite a specific style of architecture. And for me to see that in France is quite exciting. There's also, I mean, there's a bunch of things worth visiting just for the architecture alone. The place is worth it. There's also a very nice English garden that was made, surprise, surprise, for English tourists in the 19th century. And that today hosts this very, very beautiful church. It was built in the 1850s for expats. And there's also a couple of nice things. There's a very famous clock tower where you can climb up 150 or something steps, and you can have a very, very good view of the whole medieval town. They also, you know, I said in Brest, there was this big famous naval festival every 4 years. Dinan, they have their own kind of big festival. This time it's more of a Middle Ages festival. So they have it every year. It's called the Fête des Ramparts. So it's like I can't remember how to say it, ramparts? Do you say it in English? Des Ramparts, like I'm losing my marbles a bit here. But they have the Fête de Rempart every year, which is a kind of historical fair. I guess a bit what in the US, maybe you guys would call something like a Renaissance fair, where they'll do sort of lots of things to do with medieval culture, and there'll be demonstrations of archery and birds of prey and all that kind of stuff. It actually only happens, it happens in July on every even numbered year. So it's not actually every year, it's every other year. Voila, so now we've done a little bit of visiting on the eastern side of Brittany. Before we move on to the southern kind of coast of Brittany, we're going to jump over into neighboring Normandy, and we're going to look a little bit at Mont Saint Michel. So this image that you're looking at, which looks really too sort of picture perfect to even really be real, this is Mont Saint Michel. So like I said, we're not in Britain anymore, we're in Normandy. And so when you get to Normandy, again, the culture shifts. We're no longer in Brittany, and we have a whole new series of sort of connotations and cultural values and cultural stereotypes about Normandy. When I think about Normandy, I think about coastline. I think about the sea again being wild. But the biggest thing I think about really is World War II, right? And is the D-Day landings. So the huge, massive coalition landings on France as the Allies in June of 1944. Any of you that have traveled to France and that have traveled to Normandy, I'm sure will have spent time on the D-Day beaches and will have seen things like Point du Hoc or any of the amazing things that you can see on the kind of tourist trail today relating to the war. Anyway, we're not here to talk about the war today. I just wanted to note that we've crossed over from Brittany and we've crossed into Normandy. And so here is a view from up on top of Mont St Michel. And we can see that it looks out over this vast sort of bay, which borders Brittany on one side and Normandy on the other. So we're actually only 32 miles east of St Malo. So it's very, very close. It's not really like changing regions. You could easily do it in a day trip from staying in St Malo. And I guess what is it is the first question that a lot of people have. I've gone there with students and then they're like really excited. You know, you're like, what are you looking forward to most on the trip? They're like, we can't wait for Mont Saint Michel. And then the day you get there, they're like, what is Mont Saint Michel? But basically to paint with broad brushstrokes, it's a little abbey. So it's a religious building that was built up on this little tiny tidal island. And that a small town grew around, and that for a very, very long time was only reachable when the tide was out. So it's a medieval ancient abbey, okay, and it's one of the most popular tourist attractions in France. I mean, you can look at it, you can imagine why. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it has about 2.5 million people who visit it every year. So it's really, really, really popular with tourists. And you'll know if you've been there yourself, it's rammed, especially in summer. It's very, very, very busy. 44 people live there. So it's not a place that many people are moving. You can see it's just really beautiful in all kinds of different lights. It's almost completely circular. And basically at its base, there's this big outcrop of sort of granite, right? There's like a big lump of granite. And because of how long the tide takes to go out, it makes this kind of very, I guess, protected pathway there. So even when the tide is out, you kind of need to know, you needed in the past to know the right route because there's a lot of sinking sands. So when the tide, maybe I can show you better back here. Yeah, you can see. So this is now the road that has been built. I actually don't know when it was built, this causeway. But now there's a road, so even when the tide is fully in, you can drive out there. You can't drive out there in private cars, there's little shuttle buses. But before there was this road, when the tide was out, you had to walk it and take a big risk, okay, with the sinking sands. So this made it for a very naturally defensive position. And in a lot of medieval religious traditions, kind of the big idea was that the more isolated you could get yourself, the closer you could get to God, right? So the higher up, and the more alone, that's how you can have a better connection with God. And so people had been worshipping here from the year 708, so for about 1300 years. And it was a really important place for medieval pilgrimage. Okay, so religious people from all over France and indeed all over Europe would come to try and visit this abbey. And the abbey, you can see it there now, the abbey that exists today. It's not as old as that. It's not from the 1700s. It's more like a lot of kind of Gothic buildings today. It's more from the 11th and the 12th centuries, the buildings that we have still today. There are some smaller parts of the crypt, the underground layers of the church, which date back to the 8th century. But in general, you're looking at stuff that's kind of 11th and 12th century. The monastery on top, we call Le Merveille, like the marvel. And it's this kind of weird mixture where it's kind of religious buildings, but it's also kind of a bit of a military fortress. So like here you can see the end of the sort of pathway that the buses take you on when the tide is coming out. So these days you go on a kind of shuttle like this. And if anybody has any questions about sort of practical questions about what visiting it's like and how that works, you can ask me at the end. But a really sort of atmospheric place to visit. And a place that withstood time in quite amazing ways. So here's some images from up inside the abbey. This is the big refectory, the cloisters. I mean, it's weird because you're up so high, there's so many seagulls. You can feel that you're up high. It's very, very beautiful. And you have really incredible views from all around the top of the monastery. It was in use as a monastery right up until the 1780s, so right up until the French Revolution. it survived the 100 Years' War. I mean, it survived a lot of different things. But by the time the French Revolution arrived in 1789, it was a bit in a bit of a pitiable state. I think there were only about 7 or 8 monks living there anymore, and the revolutionaries very quickly kicked them out, and they converted it, and it became a prison. And so Mont St Michel actually stayed a prison from 1790 until 1863, which is kind of amazing. It's like 70 years. 70 years. And then after that, in 1874, it was classified a historic monument again, and it got a religious purpose again. In the period before that, it spent 70 years being quite a grim, I imagine, prison. And so this is one of the things you can visit when you visit today. This is a really horrible thing called La Fillette, which it was famous for, which was it's a 3 square meter metal cage that was suspended. There's a whole bunch of them. And so the prisoner would have to stay in there. So even if you moved a tiny bit, the whole thing would shake, and you'd obviously feel that on your bones. It wouldn't be very nice. A cute little town today. As I said, less than 50 people live there. I guess my really principal advice would be, if you're going to visit it, is do not plan to eat lunch there, unless you really, really, really want to, because it's very, very expensive and very kind of touristy. So it has this beautiful little old town, which is mostly kind of souvenir shops these days. And you have to walk up a lot of steps. So it's good to go early in the morning if you want to avoid crowds. And the only food delicacy, if you do really want to eat there, I can recommend to you, is the totally bizarre local Mont Saint Michel omelette, which it's very strange. This is not a very good picture of it. It's a better picture of it. Basically, it's a restaurant called La Mer Poularde, which has existed since like 1886 or something like that. They're famous for the fluffiest omelette in France. I've eaten one. They're really strange. It's kind of like somewhere between a meringue and an omelette. But if you want to go to this restaurant now, you've got to book sort of, weeks in advance. And an omelette will cost you 28 euros, which is about what, like $32. So only if you're really die-hard, want to consume the culture of Mont Saint Michel, you could go and eat one of these very fluffy omelettes. But if not, I think it's a really nice day trip to go visit it and then have a picnic out on the sands or on the ramparts. Voilà, so now, where are we at? We have had a look at St Malo. I'm pointing at the screen like you can see what I'm pointing to, but you can't at all. We've been to St Malo, we've been to Dinan, we've been to Dinard, and we've crossed over into Normandy. So now we're going to go down to the other side of the country, down at the bottom. Can you see? Quiberon. So that's the one with the Q. It's written like Quiberon, but it's pronounced Quiberon. So Quiberon is like it's a different vibe on the south coast. It's much more like a countryside feel, to be honest. And you're being much less battered by the sea up there. It's a bit more kind of protected. And it's a peninsula which juts out into the sea for about 9 miles. Okay, it's what they call in French a presqu'île, so nearly an island, but it's not actually an island. It's more like a kind of quite a rugged, windswept peninsula on the kind of southern coast of Brittany. It's really, really just very, very beautiful and very, very naturey. So there's this famous part of it called the Côte Sauvage, the wild coast. It's a really nice place for walks or doing cycling. There's bits of it where the sea can be very, very wild, and so people aren't recommended to swim. But it's a really beautiful kind of coastline of lots of caves and sort of rock formations and embracing winds, and lots of flora and fauna. So a really nice place for nature lovers in general. A big place that was settled by the Romans, so lots of Roman remains and remains of Roman fish farms. Just a really, I feel like especially after spending a few days visiting big touristy things or being in towns or being around a bit more bustle, coming down to Quiberon and spending a few days in the nature is a really sort of nice contrast to the rest of that. And there's a couple of really nice villages and towns that are very, very worth visiting, that are often kind of quite quaint and like little clusters of sort of blue and white painted houses and fishermen's cottages. This is Port Maria. which is definitely worth visiting. I did some camping once near Port Maria. It's very nice. At one point in the past, it was one of the sort of principal sardine fishing ports. So sardines are really, really big from here. And there's still about 200 boats fishing for sardines from Port Maria. And there's also another Saint-Pierre, which is a little bit, I think, less nice than Port Maria. But there's a bit more activity there, a bit more sort of hustle and bustle, and a bit more passage. This is, again, these are some pictures of Saint-Pierre, where there's a little kind of harbour and a bit more of a kind of restaurant scene, a bit more accessible for tourists. It's also where the very famous sardine cannery of La Belle-Île was. So like the sardine cannery from the Belle-Île, which we're going to talk about in a second. And yes, this is such a perfect souvenir from this part of Brittany, is to take home some canned sardines. I wonder if I can actually just get back to a map. Hold on. Yeah, here we go. If you can see down where we are in the bottom at Quiberon, and then you can see across the water, you have the Belle-Île. So that's the last place we're going to visit in this part of the tour. So we've been in Saint-Pierre, and then we can take the ferry across to Belle-Île. So this, for me, I've only visited the Belle-Ile-en-Mer once, but I found it really, really, and not on tour actually, it was more on holiday. It's less of a place where there'd be big buses of tourists. It's a bit small for that. So it's a bit nicer kind of place to get off the beaten track. Really, really nice. Again, if any of you have been to Scotland, you'll see, for me, this really could be a sort of Hebridean landscape. And so it's a little ferry that takes you across, and you arrive over to the island. You can see this is leaving from Quiberon in order to cross over. And so this is a little map of the island. You can see it's really very tiny. The main town is Le Palais. That's where you arrive. And the first thing you see, apart from this gorgeous little harbour in town, is this quite amazing star-shaped Citadel Vauban, which was a kind of military fort made in the 18th century, which these days, surprise, surprise, hosts a luxury sort of hotel and restaurant condo and a museum where you can find out a little bit about the island's history. The Belle-Île, it's interesting, it was occupied by the British in the 1760s. And when they eventually agreed to hand it back to France, it was in exchange for Minorca. And here you can see some of the ramparts of the fort. There's also some other nice little towns. I mean, by the time you've taken the ferry and you're on this little island off the coast of Brittany and you're traveling even away from the main town, you're getting into a much more rural and kind of slowed down pace of life. And this is a really beautiful place called Crozon, which is in the kind of the second largest town. There are actually also ferries that go straight to Crozon. You don't have to go directly to Palais. And it was here that they had the first of those fish canneries that made those beautiful little boxes of sardines in the 1840s. These days, it's really good, less good for sardines, more good for langoustine. You know, like the kind of big crayfish, I guess. They're like giant shrimp. And at the very, very northern point of the island, I always just want to show this because I think it's really beautiful. This is the Point des Poulons, which has this beautiful little solar-powered lighthouse. Yeah, I mean, very, very beautiful sort of nature spots. Anywhere that's a fan of cycling, for example, it's the perfect thing is to go to the Belle-Ile-en-Mer and do a couple of days of cycling. The whole thing is so small. Cycling and kind of camping is more the vibe rather than sort of being on big coaches with 50 or 60 other people. And lastly, but not least, I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the food culture in Brittany. Anyone that's been on any of my tours know that I always get a bit sort of salivaty when I get to talk about the food that's available in these places. And the food in Brittany, I find really, well, I'm into it. I like it a lot. So these are a pair of crepes. So the kind of pancakes that are pretty quotidien, like how do you say that in English? Pretty readily available, sort of every day, everywhere in France. This is something we think about as French people eating a lot. Crepes, which are usually just flour and water and maybe an egg, and they're cooked very thin, often in butter, and then you have them with sugar or lemon or Nutella or whatever. But the Breton people, they're famous for this. This is not the finished product, this is part of it, but it's a galette. And so it's a type of crepe that's made from buckwheat flour. And then basically the whole thing that they do in Brittany is that they fill it up with delicious stuff, usually including an egg, and they fry it. Now, it's interesting because buckwheat this is a little historical tidbit for you. Buckwheat in French is sarrasin. So this is a galette du sarrasin. It's also known sometimes as blé noir, like black wheat instead of buckwheat. But in general, you call it farine de sarrasin, like sarrasin flour. And in fact, sarrasin is a word that we don't use anymore in French. But in the Middle Ages, sarrasin was the word that meant Arab. So when people talked about Arab populations or people from the Middle East, they would say des Sarrasins. It wasn't a racist term. It wasn't a discriminatory term. It was just the word used to mean Arab in the Middle Ages in French. But where the history becomes a little bit racist is that the other name for buckwheat in French is de blé noir, like black wheat. And so basically I don't know when they started calling it like this, but when it became sarrasin, it was like saying the Arab wheat because it was the darker wheat. This is a little interesting thing that French people call it sarrasin, buckwheat, and I think people have no connection with the fact that that was a name for Arabs, in the Middle Ages. It's a little interesting fact. And so what you do is you make these very thin pancakes, and then you put them in a pan with lots and lots of butter, and then you crack an egg in, and usually maybe you'll put some cheese or some mushrooms or some little lardons, and then you wait until it crisps and you fold it in. And in an ideal world, it arrives and the yolk is still soft. It's really, really, really delicious on galette. And here you can see it being served with the classic cup of cider. They're mad for galettes in Brittany as well. Here you can see it just rolled around sausage, galette saucisson, and just served with French fries. Really, they're galette crazy, which is actually quite nice. Also, if you find gluten or wheat a bit heavy, sometimes buckwheat is a little bit lighter for the old digestion. In general, the thing that's really great about Breton food is that everything is really, really buttery and everything is really, really, really salty. And that for me is very good news. Which brings me neatly onto this. I mean, look at this, it looks amazing. The Coug Aman. It was developed in the 80s in Brittany, and it comes from the Breton words for cake, which is coug, and butter, which is aman, so it's just butter cake in Breton. And basically, it's just these very, very fatty layers of sugar and butter. And Breton people, they claim that it is the fattiest pastry in the world. It's got really a lot of butter. You can take a bite out of it and you kind of feel yourself aging. Supposedly, it was made by accident in the 19th century when a baker in Douarnenez wanted to save a sort of failed batch of dough, and he just added so much butter and sugar to try and save it and created the delicacy that we know today. Really, if you go to Brittany, this is, I would say, this and the galette are the two things that are the most important to eat. Also, because there's so much butter and so much salt, it means you have a lot of salted caramel. So you have salted caramel everything, salted caramel crepe, salted caramel chewy toffees, all kinds of things, salted caramel ice cream. This is another delicious dessert thing. This is far Breton, which is it's a kind of custard flan cake. It's a little bit like clafoutis, if any of you have ever eaten clafoutis. So it's like milk and egg and flour and prunes and raisins. Another big Breton thing, so it's a thing that's really specific to this region. They used to make a kind of savory version as well, but you see that less now, you see more the sweet one. It's not just kind of sweets and pancakes that people are eating. There's also a lot of things that you'd associate as maybe more kind of traditional sort of peasanty French food. So you have quigue farce, which is a traditional Breton dish, which basically just means meat and stuffing in Breton. And it's lots of different types of meat cooked together, again, in buckwheat flour. So buckwheat grows very well in Brittany. It's not a very attractive dish. You can kind of tell it's not big on the aesthetics. So you wouldn't see it in so many places, but it is a traditional speciality of the region. Another one would be poulet au cidre, so like a chicken in cider, which is made with kind of chicken breasts and mustard and nutmeg and cider. And they basically fry the onions and the apples in butter. The chicken then gets browned and long cooked with cider. Of course, it wouldn't be anywhere in France without seafood dishes as well. And you have the côte rayade, which is the kind of traditional sort of French fish and seafood stew from Brittany, which can be with a real mixture of things, but in general has mackerel, hake, eel, and ideally some mussels in it too. Cider, also a huge deal in Brittany. People drink a lot of cider. It's another great souvenir. Sardines, and the two things I would say you have to eat is the Quiberon, this buttery thing, and the galette. And the two things you have to take home as gifts are cider and sardines. Yeah, that kind of brings me, oh, I've been talking for a bit longer than I planned to talk, sorry. That brings me kind of neatly back to my my end slide here. I hope it's been interesting, or it's been useful, or it's given you some motivation to travel soon to Brittany when travel becomes a bit more possible. It's been a pleasure for me to talk about it. I really feel attached to Brittany. I like visiting there, and this doing these tours helps me travel a little bit, even when I'm stuck where I am. So thank you. And also, before maybe passing back to Mara, I just wanted to say again, as ever, just a massive thank you to Mara for continuing to help me work and being there and being maybe the most organized person I know. So yeah, I don't know, follow Girl Travel Tours, and I think there's a big program of tours coming up in the next couple of months. But yeah, thank you, Mara. And
well, thank you, Lewis.
Interesting.
You are, it's all the guides, honestly, that keep this program going. So we really thank you. And I'm just really happy that we can be a part of it. I think I have an echo because I have the Facebook page up as well. So I'm going to take that down. Do you hear an echo, or am I good?
No, I can't hear.
Okay, awesome, great. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. I know that I will always allow you to go long when you're talking about food. That's always a good thing for everybody. It makes all of us hungry, and it certainly brought a lot of good stuff to the forefront. I just put up a slide, which is a sort of a Q&A slide to get us started, Lewis, so you can start looking at the questions. But also to everybody out there, if you did enjoy the presentation and you would like to send a tip in for Lewis, there is plenty of ways to do it. You can use Venmo, PayPal. You can even write an old-fashioned check, whatever works for you. I have a secure link on my website, which says leave a tip or tip the tour guide. You can use that as well. So there's plenty of ways. You will also receive an email tomorrow with a link in it directly if if my instructions aren't clear enough for you. So Lewis, if you're ready, we can go back to the Q&A. And see if there are some questions in here that you're prepared to answer.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to start at the top. Can you tell about the current COVID travel restrictions to Europe? Number one question. The question is so large. It depends on what country you're talking about. I'm currently in the UK, and so I'm going to have to cross back into France next week, and I believe that I just need to prove that I have been completely vaccinated with a vaccine or a vaccination program that is recognized as official by France, which means I think usually the US and I think almost everywhere in Europe, with maybe one or two exceptions. So I think that now, if you're fully vaccinated and you can prove that with a QR code or whatever, it's possible to enter France. Yeah, but we have this new system in France as well called the Pass Sanitaire, where you have to scan your vaccination QR code in order to enter like museums or gyms or any kind of enclosed public spaces.
You say you have a QR code. Does that mean that who issued the QR code? Because in the United States we actually have a physical card.
The QR code, well, I guess like wherever you get vaccinated, like in your hospital or the pharmacy, they give you one. But for people that haven't been vaccinated, you can get a Pass Sanitaire just by doing a negative test. If you do a test and you're negative, they give you a QR code, which then lasts for 24 hours. So there is a way to do things if you're not vaccinated. There's going to be a lot of protest in France. People are not happy about it. Okay, so that's from John Sen. I hope that was helpful. What was the first question?
Go back to the Q&A.
I think I'm in the Q&A. Yeah, I am. Linda says, Breton is a Celtic culture, is it not? By the way, how did you choose to live and work in France, and why not Brittany? Me, I wanted to escape the rain. Like I'm from Scotland. I grew up in the rain and the cold weather. So Brittany's nice for me now, but I wanted a bit of sunshine. And so I went to the south of France, where sure, everyone's less friendly, but the sun shines 300 days a year, so it's kind of worth it. All the Light You Cannot See is a wonderful book. I visited St Malo before reading the book, and it seemed quite accurate to me as far as the layout as the city goes. Would you agree? Yeah, I thought it was pretty accurate. I think it was a good read. It was a page turner. All the Light You Cannot See, if you haven't read it, and if you're going to visit Brittany, it's a good thing to get you ready for it. What is the oldest standing building or ruin in Brittany? From Carol Gartland. It's got to be the Carnac stones. So not just those standing stones, but also some of the dolmens, some of the sort of burial chambers that were built. I mean, they're like 4,000 years old. So it's got to be them. Muffy Lutzen says, I once crossed the bay from Bretagne to Mont St Michel by foot. It would have been wonderful, but a thunderstorm came up. Can one still get a tour that walks across the bay? I'd like to try again. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can. Yeah, you see a lot of school groups going, so I'm pretty sure it's doable. Yes. Is there a favorable time of year to visit the Abbey? I would say just not in June, July, and August. I mean, visit it whenever you like, but those months it's busy, 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 busy. So off season, which anyway is nicer to travel off season, so spring or autumn. Pat Cameron says, about Mont Saint Michel, what is in the buildings, especially the smaller buildings around the perimeter? Well, I think once upon a time they would have been houses and tradespeople. Now they're almost all restaurants, cafes, and tourist shops. So a lot of them are, like you'll have, there's only one street in Mont Saint Michel. It's like one street which winds its way up. And so often you'll have a door to the restaurant. And by the time you've walked all the way through the restaurant, you'll be at the ramparts. So a lot of the buildings you see from the outside, they're like the back ends of the restaurants. So restaurants and shops mostly. Anonymous attendee asks, can you stay overnight on Mont Saint Michel? Yes, I'm pretty sure that there's one or two hotels in some of those buildings and that it is possible to stay the night there. I can imagine it costs an absolute fortune. Arlene Polangen wants to know, won't the airlines confiscate your canned sardines? No, I don't think so. I think if you get them if you get anything in your checked luggage, they have to find it, confiscate it. But I think also it's it's being made to be exported. Maybe you have to declare it on some kind of sardine form. I don't know. But no, I think you can fly home with sardines. Marie wants to know, how do you spell the dessert pie that you showed? I knew as I put it up that I should have written it, and I'm sorry. This is what Mara tells me often, is I don't write enough things on my slides. It is spelled Far Breton, just like F-A-R. It's like Far Breton, F-A-R-B-R-E-T-O-N. Portugal is attributed to beginning the slave trade. This is true. Were the privateers involved in the trade? At the point that Portugal was beginning the slave trade, it was a bit before this kind of privateer era. I would say the privateers were maybe more involved in this part of the world in the attack of sort of merchant ships, but those merchant ships were also definitely involved in the transatlantic slave trade. So I think it's kind of impossible to talk about anybody that was doing anything that was to do with like boat culture and making money in the 16th, 17th, 18th century without them in some ways making money from the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah. Oni Ventress wants to know, can one travel around Brittany without renting a car? Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a really good train system. There's good buses. For example, I showed that little link of like St Malo, Dinard, Dinan today, because that's all doable on boat. So yeah, I think it's definitely possible to do it without a car. Grace Gray wants to know how much time should we allow to visit the city and the Abbey of Mont Saint Michel? Really not more than a day, like a half day. I really like, you'd struggle to spend a full day there. Like I think if you by the time you actually arrive in Mont Saint Michel, I think even if you're going to eat 3.5 hours, tops. Yeah, I don't think you can spend a whole day there. Beth Carroll's asking a similar question about the buildings. How are they maintained? I think a lot of them, again, yeah, are in the restaurant sector or in tourist industry. Are there any similarities between the different Celtic country languages? Welsh, Gaelic, Breton? Really good question. From what I understand, Gaelic and Gaelic, so what they speak in Ireland and what they speak in Scotland, but the other way around, sorry, because it's Gaelic in Scotland and Gaelic in Ireland, they're very similar, like they can understand each other speaking. Welsh language is on another register, and as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, the Breton language also. So no, I think they're quite different. I think the two that have similarities are Gaelic and Gaelic. When was the bridge built at Mont Saint Michel? Bill, I don't know. I can't tell you. This is a gap for me. Let me go back up to the top. That one answers. Are there alternatives for people who are gluten intolerant? Or if you're gluten intolerant, all I can say is I just wish you good luck and I empathize with you and your holiday in France, because French people are really, I have to say, not the most adaptive to dietary requirements. You know, they're the kind of people that are there like, oh, you're vegetarian, that's fine. We've got chicken and fish. You know, they're really like, they can't understand life without bread and life without meat. And so even if that is changing in certain places, I'm not going to lie and pretend that they're very accommodating to dietary requirements. Marcy has asked, what is the black box? Marcy, if you can re-ask the question and tell me what black box, if I see that question, I will try and answer that. Does the town in Mont Saint Michel still have the waffle place? I couldn't possibly comment on which waffle place that is. I'm not sure, Joy. I'm sorry. Can you tell us more about St Malo and World War II? My memory is a little bit shaky about this, I have to tell you, anonymous attendee. If I remember rightly, there was like a very, well, hold on, let me think about this. There was a bit, it was bombed by the Allies and the Nazis, firstly. So it would have been bombed by the Nazis first until France became an occupied territory, and then bombed by the Allies. And if I remember rightly, there was some kind of story about them almost being in a lockdown, like they closed the city walls and they held it for a long period of time. And then there was a moment where they knew it was lost and they evacuated everyone and everybody had to come out onto the beaches. Other than that, no, I couldn't tell you more than that, I'm sorry. The cost of the round trip on the trolley to and from Mont Saint Michel, I also couldn't tell you. Every time I've gone, I've bought 50 of them. I think, in fact, that it's free to go into the shuttle because it's to stop people from walking. But I think that you just buy the tickets for Mont Saint Michel. Or no, in fact, if I remember rightly, Mont Saint Michel to enter it is free. The trolley is free, but what cost is to go into the Abbey? That could be wrong, but that feels like what my memory is. If I was in Paris, where would I take a train to for Brittany? Can you get to Mont Saint Michel by train? Not the last bit, no. No, I don't think you can get the last bit by train. The biggest and best link in Brittany for train from Paris or from anywhere else is Rennes. So Rennes is like a really major transportation hub. There's also an airport there. Why so many apples and cider? Is it the soil? Yeah, I guess apples just grow really well. I mean, apples are like one of those fruits which grow quite well in rainy climates, right? We grow them quite well here. Yeah. Do many people speak English in Brittany? Yeah, I would say more than in the south of France. People speak more English. Yeah. That answers Beth's question as well. Yeah, I would say the further north you are in France, the more tolerant people are of English speaking than the south. Are there hostels in Brittany? Is backpacking a thing? Yeah, 100%. There's a lot of kind of affordable, cheap. Also a lot of ecotourism. That's a big thing now. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Lyle confirms that the bridge to Mont St Michel opened in 2014. I love when people in the presentation do my job for me. Thank you, Lyle. Are the beaches topless? Depends where you go. I guess in most places in France, a lot of people are topless. Yeah. Whether they control that anywhere still in France, I don't know. Lise G, de rien, c'était mon plaisir. Barbara, can a person do a tour to the places that Lewis took us through? Yes. Maybe not in Quiberon in the south. Like it's like I said, like certainly the Belle-Île, it's like a lot smaller. I don't know if there'd be as many organized tours, but certainly Dinard, Dinan, Mont St Michel, St Malo, yes. Okay, Pat's question is answered. Can you make hotel reservations on the spot during the off season? No idea. I would imagine so, right? The train one. You're welcome. The train one I've already answered. Are there still religious services?
I think it looks like you've gotten everything, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. The last one was just Chris. Are there still religious services held in the Abbey? I don't know. Actually, don't know. I was hoping that I could remember that while I was reading the other questions, but I don't know.
That's great, Lewis. Thank you. I am going to cut my speaking to a very short time because I can hear the echo and I know others can too. I don't know what happened to Zoom for me, but it definitely messed it up. So I want to say a thank you to Lewis. Thank you very much. And a thank you to the audience. And we will see you all next week. Take care.